Hola, mi gente. And thank you, Nate, for the intro and for the shout out earlier as everyone's fave papi. I got to make a tagline now on that. Um, I just want to jump into this because I mean, like the title for our fireside chat, like Lisa and Janice and I have been going back and forth in prep, and there's a lot to unpack here with this topic. And it's no secret that there are disparities within the healthcare system, right? Especially when it comes to race, ethnicity, body size, sexual orientation, gender identity, just to name a few. But what impact does this have within organizations and the traditional structures and attitudes, especially with creating access to inclusive benefits? And so today we're going to dissect the expansion of benefits, the barriers to implementation, and the responsibility that brands and organizations have in shepherding these efforts. So I first want to set the stage here on who today's workforce is. According to Marsh McLennan, the modern workforce is increasingly diverse among many dimensions, such as age, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, disability. Again, this is just to name a few, right? And in that, women comprise 39% of the workforce globally, while the average age for a first birth has been rising, and positive attitudes towards single parenthood have shifted. On top of all that, there's been an increasing proportion of US adults that are self identifying as LGBTQIA2S, and more than 1 billion people experience some form of disability, and that's on the rise. So, we love to see that workforce diversifying, but industries have yet to recognize that with diverse workforces come different health issues, which lead us to some implications for employee benefits. Now, I want to turn it to some of my friends here, Lisa and Janice. First question: what is your assessment of today's corporate healthcare benefits, and why does this matter? Lisa, I want to start with you.
So, yeah, there's so much, like we could be here for hours. But one thing we were looking at the study, and analysts are calling this a crisis of well being in the workplace. And almost 50%, I think it's 48% of employees said that their wellness declined this year. So that's from Pass, which is an employee well-being platform. Meanwhile, 83% of employees believe that their well-being is just as important as their salary. So, like, that's major. And 85% are more likely to stay in their role if their employer focuses on well-being. So this is an imperative.
Awesome. Yeah. And with Janice, I in our prep too, you had some really good insights about wellness as well. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so wellness is one of those things that a lot of organizations tout it because they compare themselves to what other organizations offer, right? And the thing is, we call it competitive, but to whom? When you're not reassessing your benefits and seeing who needs what, then who is it competitive for? And I think mental health is often that invisible cost, right? And I think we think of it now. Yes, it's EAP. I know we have all of these things that truly do help us out, but I think we need to think further than that. After 2020, after COVID, after the pandemic, the amazing panel prior to this one talked about the hybrid world. So we have to rethink what mental health is and what that means for our people. But also, what does well being look like and defining that? In today's world of wellness, I consider it the whiteness of wellness, the Gwyneth Paltrow's, the Goop. And I'm a Peloton owner myself, so I may be a part of the problem. But I will say, when we think of wellness, define that for your people. And it's defined differently for everyone. For some of us, it's simply just getting through the day, getting out of bed, making it through the day, right? I know a lot of organizations, Lisa, you shared with us that a lot of organizations are hiring wellness directors. Like, what does that look like? Is that a need for an organization? And I think today we do have to seriously look beyond EAP, look beyond, the little blurb in your benefits, and really blow out what well-being and wellness really is as it pertains to mental health and the full well-being of a person.
Yeah. And actually, just to piggyback on that, I think, and we kind of talked about this in our prep, the mental health has always been an issue and kind of has been a stigma, right? And now I think people are a little more comfortable sometimes coming forward with that. And I think that we all realize that with the pandemic and the state of the world, everything associated with that, especially the DEI things, have caused is a lot more mental health, issues, like for people who maybe didn't experience that before, didn't know that they were experiencing that before. And I think bringing that to the forefront is just so important. And when you look at those stats, like, it is a great idea to have somebody at a company who that's their point person, and not going to HR or something like that. We're like, that's really, your mission of like what we care about.
Yeah, I even want to build on that too. Like Janice, I remember in our prep, we were just talking about like the definition of wellness also, and just how that's kind of been like, it's so different among cultures, right? In terms of what does wellness look like. And I remember you were talking about the Palo Santo thing. We were talking about the cultural appropriation. Like, can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, it's about the education. I think when, whether it's a magazine that's written about it, or again, getting, not to harp on Gwyneth Paltrow, but when we think about these different avenues and think about, we need to go back to what it actually means, right? The culture, sometimes it's appropriating and it's not appreciating, right? There's a thin line and there's a big difference. So I think we have to do our own research, but also truly define what wellness means for you as an individual. Mm-hmm. I think it's great that we have to collectively do it as a culture. I think that is on us as DEI practitioners, our HR friends, our leadership, everyone, but we also have to define that individually and what that looks like and means for us, because that's the only way that we can show up for our true selves, one, in the world, but also in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think even the connecting thought is like what like corporations are defining as wellness too, and giving it that room for that culture nuance, right? So amazing. Yeah. And so given those assessments, what do you believe are some barriers to implementing those inclusive benefits? Janice?
One example, and my HR friends, you all have a big job, so don't come for me because I'm not oversimplifying this, but I do recall having a conversation in my, past life about benefits, well, if that doesn't apply to me, then why should I pay for it, right? And that's typically, well, in this conversation, I'm speaking about gender affirming benefits, and not to oversimplify it, but I'm not a mother, but I do know that I pay into a pool to ensure that there's ample parental leave, right? Whether that's for my life or whether it's not. And I think a lot of times we would love for universal healthcare to actually be universal, right? And while it's not, in most cases, care is universal. Care for the people and the well-being of your entire culture and the people you work with day in and day out, that is universal. And I think we have to think about it in that way as well.
Yeah, it's almost like decentering oneself in that whole process, right? And Lisa, did you want to chime in or build on that?
Yeah, and I think, definitely we have to think about it from if everyone benefits, we all benefit. Like, it's not like, you're left out. It's like we need to bring everybody in. So even considering barriers like generational stigmas, like we talked about mental health, like I'm Gen X. You were not supposed to talk about the fact that you were in therapy, even though everyone in New York was in therapy when I lived in New York, but like it was like a hidden thing. And so I'm thrilled that like those stigmas are being busted and broken away. Thinking about politics, like I won't even go there, but like that does play a very important role, obviously, especially in healthcare, abortion access, all these other things. And then maintaining employee confidentiality and trust, right? Like maybe I'm not comfortable coming forward and, asking about mental health benefits or abortion or any other benefits. And so how does the employee know and feel safe, right, that they can really have a place to go? Is that like an outside third, kind of third party? Is it somebody internally? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, most definitely. So, we talked a little bit about, where we are and what's holding us back. But also, like, we need to talk about the defining of inclusive benefits. Like, what does that even look like? And what areas do you feel that folks are missing in all of this? I think for me personally, being trans and non-binary, gender affirming benefits is like a huge miss across. I mean, like things like gender affirming care, finding a gender affirming medical practitioner, to avoid being misgendered in a very vulnerable process, hormone replacement therapy, gender affirming surgery, not only leading up to and during, but even the post-op needs after with paid time off. And then I would even say like legal documents assistance. This feels like, like a no-brainer for me because I'm like, I need those types of things to be able to kind of function in society. Like with name and gender changes though, like it can be a process. And so having some type of facilitation with my job would be really helpful in that. But Lisa, I know we had a couple things in our prep too that I would love to hear from you.
Yeah. And I think, one quick point is that if we're not part of a certain community, we're probably not thinking of what affects those communities, right? And so that's really important that we are aware of that and B, trying to bust through that, right? So parental benefits, right? That includes adoption, right? It's not just giving birth, but we talk about mat leave and pat leave, and those terms are still binary, right? So if somebody has given birth, then their body physically needs extra time to recover. But as far as the rest of the leave goes, we want to consider, benefits for primary and secondary caregivers. I don't even like that term actually, but I know that's kind of a new term, because that leads to healthier families. So I would push back even on the primary and secondary, because when we think about, that's not how modern life is anymore in many cases. And even when it is, like, everyone should be able to have that same time off. Again, if there's a medical side, okay. But we want to push against those like systemic and societal double standards and those issues that are just not helping us. We want to think about surrogacy, expanding the benefits beyond hetero couples, right? Like, I mean, people adopt, people have surrogates, people give birth, people, maybe taking a family member or a child. So like, there's just so many things there. And then one other big thing that is absolutely not talked about and is very stigmatized, menstruation and menopause, right? And over half the population menstruates and will go through menopause, but we're not talking about it. And there are real health things that, come with that. And there's medications sometimes that are necessary, that are not covered by insurance, but insurance covers Viagra, right? I mean, we just have so many issues here. And when we think about, particularly on the gender side, right, women are not, are not focused in healthcare. So like, everything is kind of default male, which again does not help. So those are just like some of the things. I know we've got a lot more, and Janis is going to jump in on that.
Before we get to Janis, though, I did want to build, because a lot of the things that you're bringing up on, like menstruation, menopause, abortion, pregnancy, those are not just like for women, right? It's for anybody that's AFAB or like has like female reproductive organs. Like it's not like, I feel like sometimes we just get very binary in that model too when we talk about those benefits, and especially the language, which can be very harmful, right?
Very true. And then one add-on to that is also the partner of that person who is going through it is very affected. And so again, to not give that person that space and that understanding and empathy is a problem.
Yes. Hello. Janis, what you got?
Yeah, to like piggyback off of the menstruation and menopause piece, when you think about Black women, who many of us suffer from PCOS, fibroids, those things are debilitating, right? There are days you have to miss work. And then when you're getting care for it and finding a doctor who can care for it, sometimes that includes major surgery. So thinking about what that looks like as well, caregiving benefits, as we get older in age, we start to care for our parents or our grandparents, or there are many ways that we caregive that are not, to your point, so binary of just childcare, right? There are many ways that we care for people. I think we have to think about bereavement leave differently. I know a lot of times, we think of it as, immediate family and that's it. But Lisa, I'll let you share your example about, having pet, thinking about the pet, that's also a part of the family. Sometimes that is your family, but also defining, we need to expand what immediate family means. When we think about BIPOC families, they're intergenerational, right? So you could have been raised by a grandmother or a grandfather or an aunt or an uncle, whatever the case may be. And we define immediate family as brother, mom, dad, brother, sister, and that's about it. And it goes far beyond that. And sometimes your family, speaking of our LGBTQ plus friends, sometimes your family is not of the same blood, it's your chosen family as well. So we have to really expand that definition and how we think about it. When you think about, a friend of mine shared with me a couple of years ago, she was getting separated and she got a divorce and any type of family life change. I know we often think about marriage, the happy stuff, right? But what about the life change when you have to go to IT and you have to change your name and it's not because of marriage? Because sometimes someone will automatically ask you, is it because you got married? And what if that's not the case, right? You're changing your name back to your maiden name or whatever the case may be. So I think we have to really think about these benefits and expand our definitions, the things that even as a Gen Xer or a Zennial, I don't know, whichever, thinking of our generational challenges, what are the ways that we used to think about things and how do we need to expand those definitions today?
And I think one add-on there is part of the issue is we shouldn't have to share, right? Meaning you should be safe to go and say what you need without being probed. And sometimes we may want to share, or there may be like a real reason to, but you should just be able to say, I have a name change, and like not have to explain it unless you want to. But by the same token, you should have support, and divorce is definitely something that's like not included. That's a big, big deal. Like there's it affects everything. And, that's got to be considered too. And maybe people need some time off for that, just like they would for a wedding, so it's looking at all of those together for sure.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing in this part of our conversation here is just like language seems to be such like an important part of these benefits, right? Like they will either like make or break like what coverage you get essentially. You have to be like really intentional and conscious about that. And I know this wasn't part of our, but like how can folks be more conscious of those benefits, to make sure that it makes it into there?
I think it is, it's funny, shout out to Bennett because I know he's here, but we've had this conversation about the language of equity and how important it is. So it's funny that you brought that up, Ash, because it makes a big difference from job descriptions to benefits to everything, to how we speak, to how we show up, everything, even down to the ads, right? Or up to the ads that we put out into the world. Language of equity is literally everything. And I think we have to think about healthcare, to your point, Lisa, that you said earlier, access for all. I know we have our own individual benefits, but it's really not a McDonald's dollar menu, right? We have to really think of it as access for all.
Awesome. And then, what is the industry's role in introducing these efforts in the workplace? It feels like, they're taking like a step back, like they don't want to get into it, but like it's starting, like they're forced now at this point, right? Janis?
Yeah, I think you have to start by planning, to create a roadmap of progression. I know a lot of times I'm a strategist by day and night. So when I think of phasing things out, your maturity model, right? Let's start here and then we keep going. What's your progression model look like? And everyone understanding that it certainly doesn't happen overnight, right? When we're thinking about change and evolution. And in order to do that, you really have to talk to your people. You really have to reassess what your benefits package looks like today, aside from what the other competitors in our advertising worlds, we offer this and the other agencies don't offer that. Like, stop thinking about it that way, right? What is actually needed by your people? And, because when we tend to compare ourselves, we find a lot of blind spots, right? We can, we stand the chance of creating a lot of blind spots and things that we don't see. So I think a lot of times, what does that assessment look like, right? Is there a survey that you should send out? And again, you're going to get a lot of responses. We get that. But I do think there's merit in creating a progression, or what does that roadmap look like to equitable benefits? I do think there's merit in that.
And I think we're afraid of it. Like, people shy away. I'm obviously not in HR, and I understand from an HR standpoint, they're inundated, but I think it's a two-way, it's like a three-way street actually. So I would say that, like, listen to your folks and ask your people what they need and what they want. And then from an individual standpoint, right, like, care about your coworkers, like, advocate for others, think about beyond your, needs, what other people in the community need, learn about cultures and what matters to people. Like, Janis, your example about BIPOC communities and what family means, like, that's a big thing. And that there's various cultural differences and then individual differences, but even understanding that is important. The more we all advocate for inclusive benefits for all, the more we all benefit, right? That's just a fact. And then the other piece of it is, I think that we as advertisers, since we're affecting and reflecting culture, like, we've got the ability to then go to the insurance companies, like whoever our benefits folks are, and say, look, this is what we need. This is what we want. Don't give me 5 cents for orthodontia, get a better program, or whatever they may be, mental health for sure, because if anything's covered, it's barely covered and no one's in network and all that junk. I mean, I think that we have a lot of power as an organization, right? To, like, go to Blue Cross Blue Shield or whoever they are and say, this is what our folks are asking for, and we want a different plan or a better plan.
Yeah. And I think even, like, Lisa, you bring up a good point. Like, I feel like corporations, brands, agencies, they do have power in dictating like what is offered within benefits. But, I think it's not enough still, I think, or like if they get that no, it's like, oh, we did our job. Okay, this is it. There's other things that you can do outside of that, right? Like maybe even creating a budget for stipends for like certain health needs, like, again, like gender affirming healthcare, like needing to get that surgery money if there's no coverage for it, like helping develop that and providing stipends that way, rather than like having that fall on the employee to like do their own GoFundMe and just try to crowdsource in that manner. It's just like there needs to be more empathy in that regard, right?
Absolutely.
And, I also would build onto this too, like from an organizational standpoint, and we did touch upon this a little bit with the language, right? Like, we need to assess that piece, but we also should assess the systems that are currently put in place, like, and tear that shit down. Like, honestly, like, we need to start new on that, because it's just as rigid and just as binary as society is today. And basically, like, the reality of it all is that people's needs are and will change. And it's not just like about like creating enough, it's about creating enough fluidity, right, within those parameters in that language, because we have to make sure we meet those unique evolving needs, or we're going to run to the same place.
I agree. And I would even say, I'm a huge fan of tearing that shit down, but let's also think about how we can build that shit back up the right way, right? Because I think it's a two-way street, but I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I think it's the idea of not only evolution, but what starts to kind of bug me is when people are like, oh, it's so much better. Like, I do want to acknowledge what is better, and that's very important, because that is progress, but like, better isn't good enough in most cases when it comes to this. And so I like, that also has to be, it's like, yes, let's acknowledge that we've done better, and let's see how we can keep going. And I think that especially in this case often doesn't happen, because the system is the system, right? But so how can we change it?
Awesome. I got a couple minutes before we get to Q&A on this last question. So I know, like, companies, like, they don't get it right all the time, but they can go in the right direction. Like, who are some people that you're like, okay, like, you're doing something there? Like, any shout outs?
I we can probably give a few shout outs to a few brands and companies and things of that nature, but I hope I don't sound like a Pollyanna, but I think any organization who is reassessing their benefits is already on the right path. The fact, because that is a tall hill to climb itself for that to even happen. So I think when you're not maintaining the status quo, the norm, air quotes, if you will, then I do think you're starting out on the right path. Now, you do have to put that into action, of course, but I think any organization who's really pushing themselves and listening to their people and reassessing the benefits that they have. Every benefit that we need is not going to be added overnight, but any organization who is trying and really actually doing the damn thing, then I'm going to give golf claps to that for sure.
Yeah. And same. I mean, I could definitely name check some really great agencies, which is good. But I will say also, I think about the employees. So like, one agency that I was at, I don't think this was an official benefit, like written in, but someone's dog died. Right. And so people rallied, right? Because that is a family member to that person. And not only when the dog fell ill, right, that people were saying, this person's going to be out, let's like pick up the slack so that, they don't have to worry about it. Don't ping them. And then when the dog did die, like, there was legit, grieving and space for that. And the person took time off, sent flowers when they came back to the office, like people, gathered. And it's because that was because of the employees, right? Meaning that was not, top down thing. That was just the group. I mean, this was a phenomenal, inclusive group of folks where you really felt like you belong no matter what. But that's part of it too, right? Even if it's not written in the benefit, like, how are we showing up as employees or freelancers or whoever we are to ensure that those things kind of get baked in, right? Like, that person didn't have to like go and take their PTO, to put their dog to rest, and right? Like, that's ridiculous, right? So it was just like, just humanity. The more we can do that officially and unofficially, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, it's that humanity, that intentionality, that decentering of oneself, and the intent to put into action. Ultimately, that really changes the game. So we're actually at Q&A now. So I got our first question here. Have you found that EAPs or anything around that tend to center whiteness and cisgender people? This folks, ERGs are really struggling with that.
Yeah, I do think that's always been the barometer, that's always been where we start. That's always been the foundation. So yes, I don't think there's no question about that, but I do think that's where the action comes in, right? That's where the allyship comes in. How do we change that so that EAPs and all of these companies, even back to your point, Lisa, with insurance companies, understanding that they have a diverse pool of doctors. You know what I'm saying? We have the right to ask these insurance companies as organizations, as HR professionals, we have the right to do that. So I do think that it's on us and on our organizations to push these companies a little bit further. Even when you think about payroll companies, ADP, men, women, that's it. How there are other options, so I do think we have the opportunity and the right to push some of these companies as well, specifically EAPs.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback on that, one of the things I think about, depending on the ERGs or the situations within an organization, is what is an ERG for that particular group, let's say women of color or whoever it is, and what is for allies or aspiring allies or co-conspirators, right? Is what does that mean? And I think very clear parameters around that, that there should be some closed safe spaces, and then there should be some open spaces so that folks aren't kind of traumatized and things like that. So I think even just building those very intentionally and understanding that there will be certain things, that are inclusive of wannabe allies, aspiring allies, and then things that aren't, and making that okay. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I even think to build on that, like just factoring in intersectionality and all of this stuff, like being multifaceted within your identity, whether it's something you can see or not, I feel like that's also missing from the equation as well.
Oh, very much. Invisible, everything, disability, any other identity facets is huge. And it's like we're still so like, oh, I see, or what I think I see. And that may not be accurate.
Yes, yes. All right. So our second question, the reality is that most agency leadership is still male, white, cis, and new to a lot of these concepts. How do they get over themselves and learn fluidity without pushing that work onto HR or our DEIB leaders? Mr. Bennett.
Right. That is the $1 million question, right? And it's like, I think also calling folks into conversation, like we were talking in our prep, we were like, pretty much for the most part, we're kind of making an assumption that anybody attending today is opting in, right? So they're interested, and so what about the folks who aren't opting in? Like, how do we involve them and invite them into the conversation? So one thing, like we always kind of talk about just in general, is calling people in, not out, right? And behavior out. So calling folks into those conversations in a way where, you want them to hopefully want to show up, right? Which some folks just don't. I mean, let's face it, like, be honest, there's people who do and people who don't want to show up. But understanding that, my thing is always, we were talking about this in prep, when I first was like getting officially into DEI, it was always like, don't ever talk about the moral imperative, it's the business imperative. And I was like, but the moral imperative is the point. Now, thankfully, we have shifted, we've kind of flipped where people get that. But I would say if folks aren't aware or don't care about the humanity of it, talk to them about the business. I mean, those are indisputable statistics and benefits, right? It's like, it's good for business. So if you don't care about your people, hopefully you do give a shit about your folks. But if you don't, you probably care about the dollars, right? So I think it's, how do people get over themselves? I think the other thing is having, again, those conversations, like who should be having what conversation. And like I'm very much like, hey, white people, like we need to talk about this because like this isn't something that we're aware of walking through the world white, but our friends of color are. So like having that kind of a real honest conversation and waking people up a bit.
Yeah.
Yes. Go. No, I would actually say just really quickly, I would say, calling people in, I love that. And I truly believe in something that I shared with, when we started this journey 5-6 years ago, we all have to carry this water. And I do also help people identify their role in this. So when we tend to all be problem identifiers, but we don't often try to identify how we can each help to solve it. So I was very intentional with my senior leadership at the time about how can you all help to carry this water? My role in activism, there are many roles. Mine is just so happen to be corporate thugging. But I think like when we think about the role of everyone else, what does their role of activism look like within the agency? Because we do all have to carry that water. And I think that was the biggest thing that I kept pushing or encouraging in the beginning when we started our journey.
Oh, for sure. And we say the same, DEI is everyone's responsibility and we're all change agents, like period. And it's a matter of not traumatizing and putting the burden on marginalized groups, people of color, even HR and DEI, because everyone's got to join in.
Right.
Yeah. And I think also in tandem with all those things, like yes, and normalizing the conversation. Like we talk about the stigma piece, and it's like I still feel like people are still scared to talk about each other's health or like to talk about just like things that are more personal in that regard, like just to say, hey, this is affecting my work piece, and like just contextualizing a little bit more and having that support rather than just like saying, oh, like for example, like people who are parents and like having to leave work early and there being a stigma around, oh, you're leaving work early, like that's not it.
Exactly.
I have been there as a parent, and and then on the other side, I think that's absolutely true. And I think there's two things. One is that not necessarily feeling safe to share your personal, I've got to leave because I have a sick kid or whatever it may be. And the other side of that is folks are afraid to make a mistake. Like that's just the truth, especially white folks, right? Like, I mean, there's this fear of like, well, if I mess up and let me say you are all going to step in it. We step in it. I step in it. Every single person steps in it. DEI practitioners step in it. There's no way not to. But what we want to do is be willing to do it, step in it, and then correct our actions, right? And say like, I realize I made a mistake, and be honest about it. Like that's the only way we're going to get anywhere.
Like Pilar said, yesterday's person is not today's person. That was hit me so hard.
Right. The word of the century. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah. So next question, what are some ways that companies can acknowledge and mitigate the potential dangers, psychological or otherwise, that employees may feel about self-identifying their diversity dimensions officially and publicly? This is from Cass Fellerman.
I really think it's one of those things where we have to get better at creating that safe space where people can help to have that conversation, because we're not going to progress if we don't know what the issue is, right? We don't know where the challenges are. And I think, naturally we're going to be afraid to put ourselves out there. I know many of the panels before talked about vulnerability. That's hard. We're human. It's hard for all of us. But I do think it is on, the organization, not just HR, not just D&I, everyone, to create spaces where these conversations can be had. Just as we all know, closed mouths don't get fed, right? So we've got to be able to ensure that we have enough. We've created such a space where people can speak up so that we can get to that point where we have these benefits and these opportunities and these efforts and initiatives that do benefit all.
I think even for me, what comes up for me too is just like not having the information on hand. Like maybe you don't necessarily need to go to somebody right away. Like maybe there is like a third party thing you can do, but if you don't even know about that benefit, like how do you even get there, right? So we have another question about do you have any recommendations on language about requesting a need?
That's a fabulous question. Go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry. I think this is maybe, I'm not sure if this is what you mean by the question, but it's kind of like what Tasha had said, I think, in the last session, which I just thought was so great, kind of couching it in the idea of like, I work best when. I just thought that was brilliant. So, I work best when I don't have bright lights. I work best when I have quiet, or whatever that may be, so that you don't necessarily have to say, I have a disability or I have, this or that, if you don't feel comfortable doing so. And I'll say, again, it depends on the vibe and the culture, like within a company, because I've been in places where I feel comfortable, saying something, and more often than not, I don't, right? And it just depends on like how you feel that's going to be received and what your feeling of belonging is. So I think I really, really liked what she said about, just presenting it that way. And then if you feel safe to say specifics, you can. But I think that's a really great bit of advice.
I agree. And one of the things that, as I've had tough conversations throughout my career, I practice how I'm going to say it, just because some of these things are very heavy, and I know I want to make sure they hear me and they understand the needs that I actually have. So it may be too involved, but I'll be honest, it's worked in my favor a few times where I've practiced what I needed to say just to ensure that I'm using the right words and using, the language where they can hear me and not be so focused on, other things or the things that actually don't matter, and they're focused on me. So I do kind of center it on myself. Here's what I need, to your point, Lisa, and to what the young lady said, but also practice. I think that's been very helpful.
Oh, I think that's huge. And I think also bouncing it off of somebody else, right? To like hear how that would sound to them, like the role playing thing. I think that's absolutely huge. I do that too. It's like, and then I try to poke it from all angles. I'm like, well, would it sound like, would they think of it like, would it be taken like that? And you're trying to put the hat on of who is receiving. But I think having, a buddy for that is really important.
Yeah, Janis, you hit me hard on that one too with the practice, because like as someone who has a mental health disability, like communicating something like very sensitive like that is hard. So like, I don't know, this is therapy, right? So Dear Man, look this up, Google it. Dear Man is like a way to like really kind of structure what you want to say, how you want to say it, and what you need. I can't break down the whole thing because I will be here forever, but look into it. It's really great. And then the next question, I think we have a little bit more time for this one. How do we handle employers who claim to have benefits and be supportive and then change their tune once you raise your hand that you need support?
Yeah.
I think it's you don't let up. I got to be honest. I just never let up. It's one of those things where if I had to pivot to get my voice heard or to get something done, but I also always had data. That is always going to be your best friend, whether you're a strategist or not. I always had the data, right? And yes, we can talk about the Deloitte studies and the McKinsey studies that people have magically just now discovered that have been out for years, but you can get that data that is also within your organization, right? You talk to people, you don't have to spew names or anything like that, but data can't be denied. The numbers don't lie. So I do feel like that has helped me in many ways where I'm gathering data and I'm sharing, here's what we're hearing, here's what we're thinking, here's what's really happening. I know you sit up here, so you're not that close, but I never let up, and two, I always came with the data.
Well, I think that first of all, the data, yes, +1. And I think what you just said, Janet, I know you sit up here because that is really key. And I think pointing that out to leadership, because like they are up here and we're over here or over here, wherever we are, they aren't aware. And I think A, benefit of the doubt, but B, also pointing that out to them so that they realize just because you haven't seen it or thought of it doesn't mean it's not happening, again, in a kind way. And then the other thing is, and this can sometimes be hard, again, depends on what your sense of belonging is with your coworkers, but if you can grab some allies with you, like if you wind up having a sidebar, with somebody in the bathroom or in the hallway, and you're like in agreement, like gather up, and also not just folks, like all the parents, get the non-parents to talk about that too, so if there's a way to get the strength in numbers, that helps too, but that can be sensitive.
All right, we got 2 more minutes. I'm gonna try to squeeze in this last question. How often and in what format do you recommend leaders check in on your team without making internal communications as an additional burden?
One of the things I tend to, again, in an effort to ensure that everyone carries the water, I tend to arm managers, whether it's CEOs, all the way to a management supervisor, or someone who just stepped into the management role. Our managers have to be armed. You're the ones working with your teams every day. You're on these calls. You should be the ones checking in. Something I often share, just by nature of my role, people know I care. They need to know you care. They need to know their immediate manager cares. So I try to do my best in arming the managers, again, going back to so we can all carry this water. But I like to arm them with what that looks like in times of need, and also in times of just preventative. Like, it doesn't just have to be when, the 2020 happened. We should be checking in all the time, more than in our one-on-one that should be a part of our one-on-ones as well, not just a status document of what you're doing, but also how you're doing.
Like, amen to all of that. And I think that we, especially in advertising, especially on the creative side, but all sides, we tend to go like, oh, we'll postpone our one-on-one. Don't postpone those. Don't make them short, but like have them and have those check-ins, because that otherwise the person, now it's been 3 months and you haven't done it and someone leaves or they get told to leave. That has got to be an imperative all the way through.
It's giving proactivity over reactivity at this point, and intentionality, and again, decentering and really being inclusive of everybody, and creating that fluidity.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, what an amazing conversation. I'm like, heart's so full. Thank you, ANA, for having us. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Janice. Much love to everybody. And I'm handing it back to Nate.